This video is to discuss source reliability and depth. This is a handout that I have from an old textbook that I use, but I like it because of the way it shows a progression of different types of sources. So I've hung on to it for that reason. It does start off, so we're talking about reliability, which is how much a source can be trusted, and that comes down to all sorts of things related to the type of research the source itself did, the bias or lack of bias maybe that a source has, and then the depth part is how deep or how detailed it gets into a particular topic is a good way to generalize what that means. So the handout does start off by pointing out that you should judge each source on its own merit, which is true. But there are, as it says, types of sources, and you can use your knowledge of those types to get a sense of the expected depth and reliability. And that's what this chart, I guess you could call it, that's what it does. It kind of gives you a shorthand for figuring out these pieces. So I'm going to take us through this. It's kind of like a framework that I have in my mind when I look at sources. And I think a lot of people in academia have the same type of way of thinking of things. So obviously, the best type of source, not necessarily always the most appropriate, but the best type of source for an academic paper is going to be up at the top, where it's deep, reliable, credible sources. And then down the bottom would be the opposite, which is shallow, unreliable, not credible sources. So at the top of this chart, what we have is scholarly books and articles. These are articles that are published in academic journals. As it says here, they're based on careful research, written by experts, address topics in depth, and involve peer review and careful editing. And what the peer review piece means is they go off and they're reviewed by the peers of the experts. So other experts in that field will be highly critical of these articles to make sure that they fit the rigor that's expected in the field. So these types of articles are, in most cases, the best type of source for an academic paper because of the rigor and because of the research that goes into them, and because of the depth, how much they actually, how deep they go into a topic, and the length of the piece of writing. Now, the sort of downside to this type of source is that the intended audience is usually also experts in that field. So when you as a student picks up an article in a biology academic journal, you may have some difficulty picking up on some of the jargon. There may be words or terms and things that you don't quite understand. So in that sense, it sometimes can be a bit tricky for students to get into these. But I will say, if you read the abstracts and you get a sense of them, you will be able to find some good information, and they make your argument stronger if you're able to use information from these sources in your writing, because they would be highly respected in that sense. And the level of difficulty will vary based on sometimes the journal, and also based on the level of familiarity you have with the topic and who's writing it. But they will be a bit more difficult than other sources. Some you may find to be, too full of jargon that you won't even be able to really get into. You can just put those aside and focus on ones that you can actually get something out of. So that's the academic peer-reviewed journal that you hear me sometimes refer to. The next thing on this list is trade books and journal articles. I'm not sure why they say journal articles. That's a little bit misleading, but basically they're talking about things published in um, periodicals or trade books. The periodicals are referring to things that we looked at in classes, things like the Atlantic magazine. So it's a well-respected publication. They go into depth in some of the stories. Um, they go through a fairly rigorous editing process, but it's nothing compared to the type of peer review activity that goes on the academic sources. And the audience for these is more of a popular, I would say, it's more of a general audience. They're meant for the popular presses, if you will, um, but usually an educated audience. So the level of writing is pretty high. Um, the attention to detail and validity is high, but they're not going to be as rigorous with citing sources. So often you might find something in an Atlantic article that you might find is very interesting. You might want to say, well, where did they get that? And sometimes it might be hard for you to find that. That's because the expectations in that article are different than they would be in an academic paper. So good sources, but not the academic rigor that we see. So I'm not going to go over every single one of these in detail. I would say the other one that you'll probably come across a lot is this: news and topical stories from quality sources. So like a Washington Post, New York Times article, NPR, all of these things are considered quality sources, but because of the depth of maybe some of these news stories, they may not be the best sources because they might be fairly short and just scratch the surface. Um, and if they're published on, daily basis, the editing and fact checking cannot be as rigorous just because of time constraints with that. But it's good for some source, for some, current information and some anecdotal evidence and things like that. So fairly good sources, but you have to keep in mind that it's not going to go into depth for a lot of these things. Now you have to also keep in mind that something like the New York Times, for instance, they have a daily newspaper, but they also have a New York Times magazine, which covers stories more in depth. And those stories would be, I would say, equivalent to like the Atlantic magazine publications. So the New York Times magazine is a more um, something more equivalent to the Atlantic than it would be to like a daily newspaper. So there's different things that you can look at in those pieces. So I would say really anything for the most part below this line is not going to be a particularly useful source unless there's a really good reason for that. I wouldn't be, opposed to something from, a 17 magazine if it was really relevant to what you're talking about, if it served a particular purpose, but it wouldn't be a source that I would go to for, some good solid information on the source. So in general, I would try to stick to sources that are above that line. It's good to have possibly a mixture of sources sometimes. Definitely some that deal with some really high-end stuff and getting more depth. And then if the topic requires it, to get into some more topical sort of smaller stuff down here. So hopefully this helps you as you try to create a framework for different types of sources.